Wisian is a sometime scientist, full-time military officer, and lifelong space enthusiast. He has degrees in geophysics, physics, and strategic studies. Ken is also a graduate of the U.S. Air Force Test Pilot School and has more than 70 hours of high and medium risk test flights. He currently serves as a Major General in the U.S. Air Force and Air National Guard. He has combat time in the Balkans, Iraq, and Afghanistan. Well, first, thank you for your service. Thank you very much. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And without further ado, Ken Wisian. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike. All right. One thing that wasn't mentioned, that strategic studies is a master's degree from the War College. I've always thought that's something that would belong on someone like Darth Vader's resume. I don't know if it's common in the military, but I find that people outside of the military don't know what a war college is. Okay. I am in the military, so I got to start off with a disclaimer. I'm here on my personal time. Nothing I say here has any connection to government policy, thought, facts, classification, any of that stuff. So I'm Ken Wisian today, not general. Okay, what I want to talk about is ship-to-ship first contact protocols. It's an extremely common topic in science fiction. And in fact, I make no claim to originality on any of this. Although I can't survey the entire field, I'm absolutely certain every idea has been covered somewhere in a science fiction story at some point. But I will specifically cite one early 1966 Larry Niven short story called The Warriors. It really got me thinking, and no, I didn't read it in '66 when it was first released, about a decade later. But it got me thinking about first contacts, unintended consequences, dual-use technology and such that I'll get into in a little bit here. And then, a reasonable question is, why worry about this? It's such a remote possibility of having a ship-to-ship encounter, us and some other civilization in deep space. I look at it from a risk management point of view, where you look at not just the probability, but also the impact. And as we go farther out into space in whatever means, the probability increases dramatically, although admittedly that's from being vanishingly small to microscopically small, but it's still a big delta. But the impact, the potential impact, is off the scale. So for that reason, I think it's worth thinking along with all the other aspects that we think about when we try to get deeper into space. Okay, am I hitting the right button? Oh, okay, there we go. I do want to talk a little bit about the assumptions behind this. I assume that in this case, it's a calm-out encounter, which means no effective communications leading up to the encounter. There may be radio signals going back and forth, but there's no understanding. In military terms, we call that calm-out. Also, I'll assume that neither side is overtly hostile, but they're both going to be cautious. You're meeting a civilization that you have zero commonality with. So you're going to be, to some extent, on guard. And then also that at least one of the ships has a reasonable maneuvering capability, reasonable being a deliberately vague term. That in turn, I think, drives the scenario to an endpoint meeting, most likely in a solar system, because in turn, based on any kind of technology we can foresee now, ships passing in deep space are not going to have the capability to do anything other than wave as they flash by each other. So you're driven into an endpoint encounter situation. Now, not an assumption, but a caution in all of this, though, is a massive danger of anthropomorphic bias. We have no way of even knowing if we can think outside our own box. I don't know that there's anything you can do about it other than make sure you have that possibility in mind in all these types of cases. What's the goal here? Okay, the goal in an encounter, I think, the primary goal, is to avoid any ambiguity that forces the other party into making snap judgments on what your intent is. because the slightest misinterpretation, misunderstanding carries an immense risk of nearly instantaneous escalation. And that's the goal to avoid here in all of this. So that leads to developing a protocol. I'm not going to go into these, I just want to mention them just in passing. There's a lot of work that's gone on contact protocols, but almost all of it has been done in relation to SETI type things, long distance communication efforts. And there's been a little bit of government dabbling in it, but not much. What I am going to do is, and again, although I'm not speaking as military, my experiences and my knowledge on the military side inform my approach for this stuff. So what I want to look at is, what can we use from our experiences here on Earth that might serve as a guide for what we do in an encounter situation? I'm going to actually start at the bottom here. Historical first encounters, I'm not going to go into that in detail, but there's a large body of experience that we've had of civilization to civilization encounters. And I'm not talking about the long-term effects, which I think we all know have often turned out not too well for one party or the other, but simply the physical first contacts. And in that case, there's wide varieties of experiences from instantly hostile to quite peaceful. But what I want to go into in a little more detail, though, are what we do in the present day when you have ship-to-ship or aircraft-to-aircraft encounters primarily. We have over thousands of years evolved international law, customary practices and such that guide encounters, say on the high seas or in the air, between not necessarily unknown civilizations, but between different countries. And I think it can give us something that we can distill some principles out of. First, for instance, in ships at sea, when they meet. In all these cases, usually at least one vessel is military. Military vessels have the right to inspect civilian ships on the high seas. Well, how do you go about doing that? Generally, it starts off, in this case, with communication, and there's a whole hierarchy of communication attempts that are tried. The first, obviously, being voice communication over radio, falling back to things like flag signaling, optical signaling. Even a shot across the bow is in there. So yes, under the right circumstances, gunfire can be a method of communication. At some point or another, intent is discerned on both sides. Generally, the more maneuverable ship, usually a military ship, matches course and comes alongside. In this case, in the picture here, these are two relatively small ships, direct boarding. But on the high seas with large ships, generally a smaller ship will be used to go from one to the other in between. I'll come back to that later. But again, in these cases, they're gentle maneuvers. Predictability is an important part of it. In the air, here you have a photo from an actual intercept of a Bear bomber from Russia by a US F-22 somewhere in the Alaska area. In air-to-aircraft meetings, obviously you can't just stop. You got to keep moving. Again, there's hierarchy of signaling methods up to and including maneuvers to convey intent. But there's other things, some of which you can see in here. It's probably hard to see, but this bomber has machine guns in the tail of it. They're pointing directly back, or sometimes they're stowed kind of pointing up. What they're not doing is pointing at the fighter aircraft. Things like that are a good general rule. How many people's parents ever told them, don't point? Well, you know, if you have armed vehicles, that's probably a good idea in an encounter situation. Don't point. The aircraft itself is alongside the bomber. What he's not doing is getting behind it in a position that implies shooting potential. He also won't have his radars probably in a shooting mode. So he's alongside. Neither one's reacting sharply. They're being pretty calm about everything they're doing. Those are good rules of thumb. They're not always followed, even though they're supposed to be rules in international engagements. And that's when you have international incidents that can lead to escalation. So based on that's a very quick skimming of the surface of what we do in encounters here, I think you can distill some principles that would guide an encounter in deep space. And these are in what I think is a deliberate order. First and foremost, be predictable. Second, avoid any appearance of hostile intent. I'll go into a fair amount more detail on that in a minute. And although I'm not going to address it here because that's a whole other discipline which I don't have a background in, attempt communication. Obviously, you're going to be attempting to get communication going. It's vital that that happen at some point. But these are the general principles that I think apply. They apply in a lot of situations. These apply equally well if you're stopped by a policeman on the highway. I mean, they're a good general guide to an encounter type of situation. Okay, a little more detail. Be predictable. Most of that boils down to maneuvering. And in that, there's various ways you can be predictable in your maneuvering. The first and easiest is don't change anything you're doing. If your engine's on, leave it on at thrust setting. Don't change your heading, just maneuver straight ahead, assuming the other guy's going to be doing the maneuvering to match. Another possibility, though, to be predictable might be, okay, slow down or stop, going straight ahead. Again, don't change your heading, but just come to a stop if that's a practical thing. But there's a third option, which may not be so obvious. Again, most likely an endpoint encounter in a solar system, maybe you need to brake to enter a stable orbit. At this point, you'll have to be going on hope that the other guy can figure out that's probably what you need to do, so that maybe you need to flip around and turn on your engine so that you can brake and achieve orbit. Any of those paths might be a reasonable path towards being predictable. And then an ancillary that make yourself as visible as possible. Lights on, beacons on, that kind of thing. You don't want to give any possible thought that maybe you're trying to hide. Now, secondary to this, you know you've seen another ship out there at some distance you're approaching. When do you start being predictable? I would say as soon as you can see that there's something that's going to happen. Odds are he has at least as good a technology as you do. He can see you start being predictable from that moment. Okay, now a little more detail on avoiding hostile intent. Just for the sake of argument, I think it's highly unlikely, but just say your ship has actual weapon systems on it. Okay, this one's pretty easy. Keep them in standby or off. Don't point, those kinds of things. Remember, there's other things that can apply though. Jammers, decoys, probes. That's the easy one. Don't worry too much about that. But I do want to highlight a little bit of what really lies at the root of this, avoiding appearance of hostile intent, and that's the perception problem. I'm smiling right now. Okay, for us, easy signal, nice, friendly. For most species on Earth that have faces, that's a threat signal. Think about the possible misreading of intent. That's within our own knowledge of existence. A white flag. Most of us here think, okay, white flag, surrender. Or it also is meant to mean a request for parley or truce. That is far from universal, even within human experience. That's more of a Western convention, and a fairly recent one. So I just throw those things out there. They're not directly related to this, except for think about how perception problems can come about. You have to question every assumption you have, and you have to realize that you're making assumptions without even thinking about them. So, hostile intent. It's a lot more complicated when you consider that any spaceship is going to have weapons-capable systems on it, even if that's not the intent of them being there. Things like your main drive. Short of sail ships, anything we've thought about, the main drive is a highly destructive weapon for a long ways behind the exhaust of a ship. So, say you're doing a brake, you decide, okay, I've got to do a braking maneuver. What would you want to not do? Pivot and slew your exhaust across the other guy, even if your engine's off. What are you doing then? You're forcing him to make a snap judgment. Is that guy slewing and going to turn on his engine as he passes me? You want to avoid putting the other person in a situation of a snap judgment. Communication systems. Anything powerful enough to communicate across interstellar distances has a lot of destructive potential close in. That's well, I don't want to spoil it, but that's part of the Larry Niven story. So, that has you think, okay, I want to attempt communication. Do you want to use your main communications laser to do that? Probably not. Low power, omnidirectional, so that you're not even slewing a physical thing at the other person. Hazard mitigation systems. Who knows what technology will bring? Maybe you have a system that moves or destroys collision objects in your path. Obviously, weapon systems capable there. Shields. There may be shields that are essential for keeping the electronics or the biological inhabitants of a ship functioning. Can they be turned off? Can they be reduced in power? Probes and shuttles. I mentioned ship-to-ship boarding using an intermediary ship. Okay, if you're in an encounter like this, both sides are wary. A hatch opens into the ship and a small ship comes out and starts heading towards you. How do you guarantee the other guy knows that's not a bomb or a weapon system? All those things have to be, it's going to require a lot of on-the-spot judgment. And then you have sensor systems. Those aircraft that I mentioned earlier have radar systems. In some modes, they're just looking around seeing what's there. In other modes, it's a preliminary to firing your weapons. Both sides are going to be trying to collect as much information as possible on the other side. It might be wise to stick to passive systems until you have communication established. An active system, even a radar system scanning the other guy may come across as jamming equipment or such. Lots of potential unintended consequences or perception problems in all of this, as you can see. And again, big danger of anthropomorphic bias in all of this. A few other very brief issues I want to mention. You have a ship there. Oh, I don't remember if I said this at the top. Any of this would apply as equally well to an AI ship as a human crewed ship. I'm agnostic as far as that goes. If you had military and civilian crew on board, who takes lead in an encounter situation? Civilian chain or military chain? Most of us from the Western world default, oh yeah, it's got to be civilians. Well, again, that's not a universal civilizational precept in the U.S. You would also want to build courses of action in that allow for escalation, de-escalation as necessary, in particular trust building maneuver process. So maybe you'd want to leave some systems powered on just so you could power them off later and show good intent. And then lastly, all this, the principles and such, the building of courses of action, no matter what happens, as I think everyone would automatically assume, it's just a starting point. In the military, we have a saying that no plan survives contact with the enemy. You always have to adjust once things start. And no matter what you develop, these are just guiding principles and shouldn't be a straitjacket in an encounter situation. Things would be very dynamic and again, can escalate quickly. It takes that ability to think on the fly and adjust as you see fit. So, in conclusion, this is just a start, it's just one viewpoint on how to approach the subject of an admittedly unlikely scenario, but a scenario with monumental impact. And I think what can be distilled are some guiding principles of be predictable, avoid appearance of hostile intent, and attempt communication. And with that, happy to take any questions, constructive criticism, or suggestions. Thank you very much.